Okay, welcome everyone to round 5 of Santo 2020 on a motion in cities with scarce housing availability. This House prefers program which provide the means for those in need to relocate to different cities with lower cost of living instead of programs to build or subsidize affordable housing in the same city. I call this House to order and yield the floor to the Honorable Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Hi, just checking you can hear me.
Audio is loud and clear.
Thank you. People relocating to other cities is an enormous benefit to those people, but it is also an enormous benefit to all of the people that live in the other cities that they would move to and to the people who live in the cities where they currently live. People would relocate if they had the capital too. The problem is that they do not. We give them that agency. We're going to make two arguments in opening government. First of all, we'll explain why the quality of life for people who live in public housing is better elsewhere. But second of all, we'll explain the way in which we rectify a first mover problem to the development of cities, which benefits everyone. First of all, 5 notes of setup. The first thing to say is that the way we would do this is just to provide direct economic capital to people to be able to move. And so we would give sort of capital for the process of relocation. We would also give additional welfare once you've moved to incentivize people to take it up. The second thing is that we would provide specific support programs to help people choose the nature of their relocation. So if people wanted to prioritize moving to places that are culturally similar to the places where they currently live, we would allow them to choose that. But if they wanted to prioritize specific work opportunities, we would also give them support to be able to choose that kind of thing. The third thing to say is that obviously we would not force everyone to move. We would just offer it as an option and encourage it using the incentives that we described earlier. The reason that all of that is important is just that if the opbench wants to run arguments about people having to consent to this or this meaningfully taking away people's choice, it doesn't. We give them choices and we incentivize them to move. If they do not want to move, obviously they still have the opportunity to stay. The fourth thing to say is that the cities where these people are likely to be moving are already receiving huge amounts of funding, which we think is important. And that's just for the reason that governments want to stop urbanization. They want to stop certain cities from they want to stop the harms of when certain cities get super overcrowded and costs of living go up. So they try to invest in other cities to try and pull away from that. That means these cities already are getting a lot of funding, and that is important. But the fifth thing to say in setup is just that the thing I explained in my introduction, which is that the people who live in public housing and potentially would want to move to other cities, they cannot do. The reason that they cannot do that now is they do not have the capital to. That's just for the reason that if you're living in public housing, moving to another city is expensive. You don't have the capital to do that. We give these people the capital to do it, and we think that that will be good. First argument then, why is your quality of life elsewhere likely to be better? Two things to say. The first and most obvious reason is just that the cost of living in these other cities is likely to be lower. And that just means that you can afford to buy more things. And I know the enormous impact of that, right? Currently, these people are living in cities where they can barely afford necessities. We enable them to relocate to places where they can afford necessities, but not only that, they can also afford things like luxuries. That's things like you can actually, take your children to a local art gallery. You can do things like eat out at restaurants. All of these things are things that make people's lives meaningful. They make them happy. They cannot afford to do them where they are currently. Where the cost of living is lower, they can do those things, and that provides enormous happiness for people that choose to move. But the second reason why their quality of life is likely to be better is just that there are likely to be more job opportunities. And we know that that is fulfilling just for the reason that people often enjoy work, but also for the reason that working also gives you money, and money allows you to access an enormous amount of other things as well for the reasons that I explained. So why is it that the job opportunities are likely to be better? And we know that maybe this is not true immediately, but it is certainly true in the long term for two reasons. First is just that the kinds of new cities we are talking about are often built near industry, but the ones that they are likely to be forced out of, ones that are overcrowded and ones where the cost of living is getting really high, they are built around high-skilled industries. They're built around things like tertiary education. They're built around sectors like finance. We note the way that a lot of cities empirically evolve is in that way, but when these other cities are developed, they're often developed around industry. And sort of the example of that is Sydney and Newcastle, right? Newcastle developed around industry, and that means there's a lot of far more low-skilled job opportunities there. But Sydney, it's very, very hard to get a job because all of those jobs are likely to be high-skilled. The upshot of that is just that you can get more jobs in these places, and that is for the reason that if you are living in public housing, if you are poor, structurally you are less likely to be able to afford education. But also, just statistically, you are less likely to have been educated, and that's perhaps the reason that you cannot get jobs in those places. All of that is to suggest that in cities where industry is prioritized, you're far more likely to be able to get a job because they do not require things like tertiary education. They often offer more low-skilled jobs. But the second thing to say is just that you are more likely to be able to afford upskilling programs in places where the cost of living is lower. And I think that's, again, for the reason that the cost of living is lower, but also you probably have more money to afford that kind of upskilling. All of that is to say, in these cities, people are able to access far more money. They're able to access a higher quality of life. That is automatically a win. I will take closing.
So by deliberately not subsidizing housing, people are then forced to be homeless. That takes away the idea that they're consenting to moving, because in your world, the alternative is homelessness.
No, they are not becoming homeless, because we think in huge amounts they are likely to move. And as I'll explain in a second, that also frees up other housing for other people. So no, homelessness does not happen when an enormous amount of people move. But also public housing currently exists in these places. We move a huge amount of people out of them. That is probably good. But now I'm going to explain why this rectifies a first mover problem to development of cities, which benefits everyone. And the note that I make here is that the reason that smaller cities do not currently get development, the reason that people do not currently move to them and do not get developed, is a first mover disadvantage, right? If you are the first person to move to a city and you are the first person, to want to access things like cafes or restaurants or schools, that's difficult because they do not exist yet. They have not been developed, and there's a disadvantage to being the first person that moves there. We fix that in two ways. First of all, people are likely to move in large scales, which just means that development happens far, far more quickly. You don't have to wait for people to naturally decide to move to these places. They move in massive numbers under our model. But the second thing to say is that to the extent that there is a first mover disadvantage to being in a city that is less developed than a major city, we cushion that disadvantage by providing welfare. And that means that people are able to insulate against those things anyway. What are the benefits of that? First of all, we create communities in smaller cities and we enable them to grow. And that gives economic injection to entire cities, right? Like, this benefit does not just accrue to the people who may move or may not. That is an enormous benefit to huge amounts of cities, and that by getting a huge amount of development there. But the second thing to say is that when you start to develop these cities and when you overcome that first mover disadvantage, we incentivize enormous external investment from businesses, because now businesses see these small cities as viable. They are far, far more likely to invest. And that, once again, gives a huge economic benefit, not only to the people that live there currently, but to the people that are likely to move. All of that suggests that people's quality of life in these cities is better for a huge amount of people. The note that I'd make is just that there are huge harms to living in cities that are super, super overpopulated. And those are all harms that we avoid by developing these smaller cities. That is, first of all, things like pollution and overcrowding, things like being in rundown trains where things like going to work in a train that is super run down, things like just being in apartments that are super, super small. Those like experiencing huge amounts of pollution, those are all harms of overpopulation that make people's lives miserable in these big cities, and we fix that. But second of all, we would say that there is a specific harm to subsidizing housing that this opposition bench has to deal with, which is just that it inflates house prices, and that harms everyone, right? Landlords raise prices when people are given more housing subsidies, and that just means that housing becomes far, far more inaccessible for huge amounts of people. We make housing accessibility better. We stop harms of overpopulation. Incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. I invite the Leader of the Opposition. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
Loud and clear.
Okay. Okay. 3, 2, 1, go. When people have been living in cities all their life, when their friends and family are there, when their current jobs are there, when their kids are in the schools within these areas, they do not simply get up and move to another area, even if there is economic benefits to it. Note the only mechanism that opening government gives to why you would move to a different area is this first mover advantage, which is purely economic benefits. They say that cafes will exist in time. They say that other economic benefits will exist in time. No, this is purely economic, and as per our analysis, even if there are those economic benefits, you are not likely to move to these areas anyway, regardless. 3 things in this speech, then. Firstly, why you're not likely to move on either, not likely to move, and you're likely to remain in the city that you are. Secondly, why it is the case that this reduces political capital to improve the standard of living in the cities that you already exist in. And thirdly, why it is that even if you do move, taking government at the best, why these cities are just worse for you. First thing then in this speech, why is it the case that you just don't move to these other areas? 4 reasons why. 1, because your friends and family and your social lives are in these areas. Note what this means. It means that the people you care about, the people you socialize with are in these areas, and you cannot imagine spending years away from these people, living at a great distance away from these people, especially in like bigger countries that suffer from severe overpopulation, such as India. Secondly, note that you have jobs. Most working class people in social housing do have jobs. They're just low-skilled jobs. This means that often these people would have to relocate, would have to find a new job. This is hard for many people from low-skilled backgrounds because you're in a low-skilled job that doesn't, and you don't have that much CV. You don't necessarily have a good education, and you don't have a CV that differentiates you from other low-skilled workers. This means that there's a fear that if you leave your current job in your current city to move to a new city, you're not going to be able to find a new job. So economically, you don't want to move in as well due to fear of getting a new job. Thirdly, often you have, especially an older person, a middle-aged person like most people are, you'll have kids. These kids are being in schools. You don't want to move them away from this because it moves them away from the social circles, which is often traumatic to them. It also worsens the quality of the education that they receive because they're being removed from the classes that they're in where they know the teachers and the teachers know what their difficulties they're suffering from to actually help them in. But fourthly, you often have to have a personal attachment to the state, to the city that you're in. It is often, in most cases, the city that you grew up in. It is a city that you know the way around. It is a city that you're close to other people in. It has a personal attachment then, and you identify with that city. You see yourself as coming from this specific city, such as Dhaka or like Birmingham, where I come from in the UK, and you see yourself as a Brummie, which is what people from Birmingham or I am called, come from in the UK. This means you do want to move away from the city because you have a personal attachment to it. You maybe support, for example, sports teams within the city. Now, this weighs over economic. Note that one, we rebut the economic incentives with the jobs, and it also weighs over any economic incentives as well, because these things are immediate and not distant in the future, and you don't know whether you're going to get those economic benefits, which I'll rebut later on in my speech and explain why you won't get anyway. Second part of the speech, then. Why does this reduce the amount of political capital you have? Note that as per my analysis, most people are going to stay in the cities that they were born into. Note then, or they're going to stay in the cities that they're in initially and not move with these schemes. Why is this just worse off then? One, this just simply reduces the amount of money that you can be spent for the schemes that are in your own city. As in, it just makes the squalor worse in the cities that already had overcrowding to start with, because now they just have less money to spend on this. But secondly, it also reduces political capital to do further action within these cities. Middle class people within the city, so the ones that vote more because they feel most enfranchised, because they feel the state represents them, because it's full of mostly middle class people who run politicians who support policies that are like them. Most of these people feel that they've already done something for the underprivileged people in their cities. They feel they've given them the opportunity to move to new cities instead of staying in the cities that they're already in, because they feel that they've given them these opportunities and they've not taken these opportunities. They're now for less inclined to want to offer them more opportunities in the cities that they currently live in. This just reduces the amount of political capital you have to actually getting things to deal with the squalor and deal with the housing crises that are in the major cities that already have the worst housing crises to start with. This one just means that squalor gets even worse and the living conditions get even worse because they don't spend money on things such as building sanitation within slums. But secondly, it also just means that like the middle class has more aggression and microaggressions towards the lower classes as they feel they should be moving out of the city, as this is the policy that they're not taking up. Okay, I'll take a POI from CG before moving on. OG?
This entire case is reliant on people not moving, but even if only half of the people take up this opportunity and move, we still get all of our benefits.
Okay, that's the next part of my case. Great, I'll respond to that. Was my next part of the case. Respond to that. We also won on the first case, and that's logically part of yours because they don't move, then you don't get any of your benefits. Okay, next part of the speech then. Why is it that's just worse if you do move, both for you and the other people living in that city? No, the opening government's only benefits to this is that the costs where you move are lower, but know that salaries are correlated with costs, because your salaries are lower in cities that have lower cost of living. This is because low-skilled jobs that these sort of people work in often have very high levels of competition because anyone could do those sort of jobs, and you're only increasing the level of competitions within the other cities as you move more people to it. What this means is it means that the wages you get paid in these cities get driven down to a point, because of that competition, they get driven down to the lowest amount that they can pay you until it looks bad on the companies and they cannot pay you less because they look like a sweatshop. What this means is it means that, yes, because they have lower cost of living in these cities, but this also means they just pay you less because they can get away with paying you less, and there's so much competition for those jobs that it's they can just offer lower salaries, and if you don't take it, someone else will just take it instead, so those wages get deflated because there's increased demand for lower wages. Okay, why is this then worse for these cities? Firstly, there's just less jobs. Most companies are not within smaller underprivileged cities, they're in the big cities. This is because you do need some technical financial workers and you do need managers. Even if you're a manufacturing job, you need to be close and in the suburbs of the big cities to be able to employ like engineers to fix machines, to be able to employ software developers, to be able to employ managers, to employ financial people who work in the offices. So you still need to have those technical people that exist in the big cities more. But the biggest market to sell services to and the biggest market to sell goods to is in the big city. So you want to be there, and particularly the big like service sectors which employ a lot of underprivileged people are definitely in the big cities to sell to the large populations within the cities. So most jobs in the cities. And as we're flooding the smaller cities now with even more people, these issues only get exacerbated. Secondly, you just simply, these poorer cities just have worse public transport, worse public healthcare, worse state schools, and all the things that poor people need to actually live. Note that they have this because there's lower amounts of taxation because there's not as big middle classes in these poorer cities. This just means you get worse state services. That means the poorest people who often rely more on these state services, such as public transport, state healthcare, state schools, are just worse off now as a result of this. But thirdly, there's less political capital to care about these people in poor areas now. A, because they're smaller areas, because they're not swing states ever, because everyone in them is poor, so generally just votes to the left, so no one cares about them. But B, they're just smaller areas and smaller cities in general, so nobody cares about these poorer individuals within the smaller cities. So you just get less political capital to do stuff about poverty now in general. That response to opening government, and take their best case, we also outframe them like, yeah, vote opening opposition.
Thank you very much, Leader of Opposition. I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Sorry, just give me a sec, get my paper sorted. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, on if the quality of life in these new cities is going to be preferable to your old city. Secondly, then on is this sufficient to actually encourage you to move? And thirdly, on the extraneous benefits that we brought you, but also on the ones that OO brings you. Firstly, is quality of life in these cities going to actually better? OO gives you 4 reasons, which I think are actually entirely unresponsive to all the preemption we gave to you at Prime Minister as to why it is the case that these cities are going to be worse. Firstly, they point out that salaries are going to correlate. It is that when you are working a less skilled job, you're just going to get paid less. Yep, this is actually the precise reason why, given that you are like a symmetrically low-skilled worker and are probably going to get paid a symmetrically low-skilled wage for the kind of jobs you're doing, you'll just far rather live in a city with a lower cost of living, right? Because it's not the case that like doing the same job in each city has a different amount of pay, because the amount of like skill and the amount of labor and the amount of economic value that you're contributing is the same. And especially in the modern day, when you have things like exporting between cities and when things like rail links and things like being able to move goods between cities is really easy, that actually describes exactly why the kind of salary you're going to get for a specific job is pretty symmetric in both cities. The problem with being in the city you're currently in is there's a ton of people who are just able to outbid you because they work in high paid jobs because they earn higher salaries. That was what we brought you at first. So when they're saying the salary is correlated, that was unresponsive. Second, they said there's going to be less jobs. Because even if you have manufacturing, you still need to do things like ship out engineers. One, unclear why all our mechanisms on getting things like investment in these areas are not able to overcome this. Secondly, though, we gave you direct reasons why new cities were actually going to be able to effectively develop. And insofar as, yep, in the short term, of course, these cities were probably going to have less jobs. We still gave you the welfare cushion with which you could actually survive that period until the city was going to improve. But finally, as I flagged earlier, cities are just able to export things, right? Even if it's true that you're away from like the biggest consumers of manufactured goods or the biggest consumers of whatever products, like maybe agriculture that you're producing, you can just like export them. It doesn't matter anymore, right? We have things like effective transport links, which can take goods around the country. That is probably fine. But the final thing I'd flag here, if the job you're working is so good and they give you reasons to believe the job that you're working would be good, this analysis doesn't matter because you're not the kind of person that's going to move. It's only the kind of person who is most likely out of a job or was super hard to actually find a job that was going to matter, because if you could find a job you could probably stay on your feet. You're probably not the kind of person that's going to be living in public housing, which is exactly why all their analysis about why you'd have a good job literally did not stand in this debate. Thirdly, they say you have worse infrastructure. One, we rebut this in setup when we said there's a huge amount of government investment in these areas, not because of fiat, but because the government has other incentives to improve these areas to do things like alleviate the harms of urbanization. But secondly, there's actually easier to get good infrastructure in these cities structurally, because when it's a major developed city, you can't do things like take down the whole rail network in order to improve improvement, because that would literally ruin the city's economy. Conversely, in a city which is underdeveloped or is being newly built, it's far easier to do things like pre-plan and like do a good like rail system. That's why a lot of major cities have not actually updated their public transport in decades or centuries, because they literally just can't manage to do it. Finally, though, they say that reduce political capital. One, we say we don't need political capital if we get you to a city where there's better job opportunities. But secondly, we said there's already an external government focus which is able to bypass this. That explains quite simply why all our material on the quality of life is still standing. So we say that the cost of living is lower. So now you can actually afford things to do, like go on holidays, like take your kids like out on the weekend and actually just like enjoy your life and not be living under the cruel reality that is living paycheck to paycheck. But secondly, because there simply will be more job opportunities for the kind of person who is already struggling to find a job, to find a job because of where that city was located. But finally, because if the problem was upskilling, you could now actually afford to do it on the outside and you're going to improve your quality of life. That explains why the quality of life in the city is in fact preferable. Note, we give the analysis as to why people know this in the status quo. The problem is simply that they're unable to enact this insofar as they want to move to this new city. Don't do it. What do they give you secondly then on the issue of are they actually going to move as to why these people do not move in the status quo? They give 4 things. Firstly, they say that there's things like friends and family. 1, you're probably friends with people that are similar economic condition to you and are probably going to move already. Secondly, you probably move your family with you if you are the person with a family. But finally, people move in the status quo. People move for jobs all the time and leaves their family for an opportunity. Entirely unclear why this is something that no one wants to do. Secondly, they say that there's going to be no jobs there. Already respond to this. Thirdly, they say, well, you're not going to want to move your kids. 1, probably good if you're now able to move your kids to an area where there's cheaper schooling and they can just like hang out with you more because you don't have to work like 15 hours a day. But secondly, the type of person we're talking about probably just doesn't have kids, right? Because if you're struggling so hard living paycheck to paycheck, you're not the kind of person that, takes on having a child, given that's kind of a really expensive thing. Finally, though, they said you have a personal attachment to city. 1, panel, super uncomparative, right? People engage in moving in the status quo. It's entirely possible that you just simply choose to move to another city. I think like the revealed preference of normal people shows that it's just not that important in their calculus. But secondly, you probably view this as a city that screwed you, the city where you had no opportunities and you were suffering day to day. You're probably more than happy to escape it when given the chance. That explains quite simply why, 1, people are going to move, but importantly, they're going to move with the recognition that is a good thing. Panel, we give people the agency to make the decision that they know is going to improve their life. That not only explains where their life gets so much better, but it's something that we should principally allow. Before I move on, I'll take closing. Not opening.
Look, we
right,
think
cool.
that we think that like the incentives that draw people to major cities exist on both sides. Even if some people leave, more people enter and like the problem persists.
Right. Okay. So 1, if it's the set of people that are moving in that are more aligned with the economics of that city, that seems fine, right? Because now you just have people that can actually engage in that market. But secondly, I don't understand who is moving in. Like if your problem is that there is like housing is inaffordable, who do you imagine is going to move in? I'm really confused where this is going. Okay. Next thing we brought you though is this first mover disadvantage that we are able to overcome, which is simply that in the short term in a new city, it is like difficult to live there. We can see that, but our welfare payment is able to overcome this. That means that in the future, we give the government the silver bullet to the problem that's plagued them for years, that they are not able to like fix the problems of overpopulation in major cities. Because you force people to go to this you encourage people to go to this new area, you give them the means to actually survive that, and that means that you fix the population problem there. You give the cash injection to the local area so that if it is true that these cities are poor, a direct fiscal injection means they're actually able to do things like develop themselves, do things like have goods, like money to spend on goods. But finally, their businesses will actually invest. That not only means that the new city gets even better than I just described, but it also is a benefit not only to people who already lived in that city, but people who are now empowered to make choices later. People who hated living in big cities, and even though they could still afford to live there under off-bench side, they literally hated it. Finally, though, a piece of analysis as to why off-bench's material is likely particularly useless. We think that in the status quo, people hate building apartments, etc., because it means that you overburden infrastructure. This is all their analysis about how like the middle income people have a lot of economic power. This means that on their side, the most likely policy to be used is direct injection. This is really bad though, because it inflates housing prices when you have more money being spent. And that means that insofar as there is no alternative, something that off-bench cannot claim, then you're just more likely to put up house prices. Landlords put up prices. So people do not actually get greater access to housing. Landlords just line their profits with government checks. That seems really ineffective for getting people off the streets. Panel, we want people to have the choice to move to a new city if that's something they want to do. Status quo fails to give them that choice, but we give them hope.
Thank you very much, Deputy Prime Minister.
Sorry,
I'm happy
can I
to-
go to the toilet?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry.
All right, welcome back. I'm happy to invite the next speaker, Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Okay. Am I audible?
Audio is perfect.
Great. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the most important thing that like OG fails to recognize is that in order to get political change, you need to have some degree of political capital in the first place. This means people who are rich, people who are well educated, people who actually have time to lobby the government, right? This is extremely important because what does PM and DPM tell you? They agree that the people who move tend to be the poorest individuals, i.e. people with no familial ties, people who are unemployed, people who have no kids. And this means that these individuals are the ones who have no political capital to get any of the impacts they actually want to claim, right? So even if we take the best case and say that these individuals do move, and a large amount of them do move, this means that they don't get any of the benefits they talk about because they've never proven to us why someone who oftentimes are the bottom of oftentimes the most overlooked in society is going to be cared for by the government anyways, right? This is why oftentimes you have even in cities in general, oftentimes poorer areas or within racial enclaves, for example, tend to have different amounts of funding because of the different amount of political capital. I'll be doing two things in my speech today. Firstly, I'll be proving to you why life in these new cities are far worse, but secondly, how we actually create change in the existing major cities anyways. Firstly, let's just talk about new cities and how they look like, right? I think firstly, just recognize there's a contention in the OG's characterization of how these new cities look like. First, they tell us, oh, it's well-funded because governments want to limit urbanization and therefore they'll spend money in these new cities. But then they tell us it's also a first-mover problem where people don't want to move because no infrastructure currently exists. This means that what's likely to exist in these new cities is that you have limited development in the first place, because I think in the first place, governments can't justify spending a huge amount of money developing new cities that no one currently lives in, right? This is extremely important because in order for them to actually reach a level of development, which is allows for the quality of living they talk about, you need political capital and funding to be directed into these areas anyways. I think then Matt tells you, I think insofar as both sides agree that oftentimes the poorest people move, I think this interacts with the kind of impacts that they talk about, right? I think firstly, just infrastructure development. We tell you there's going to be limited to no development in these new cities for two reasons. One, because you have limited social political capital, right? i.e., you're oftentimes racial minorities. You have probably low income. You don't you maybe try to find work and you don't have time to do things like lobby the government, right? But two, I think businesses don't want to move insofar as there's no skilled labor currently moving en masse to these new cities, right? This means that you actually don't have there's therefore a trickle down effect where no services for example supermarkets want to set up shop where these unskilled workers, low skilled workers want to actually work at, right? Because there's no population that they actually can support. I think this just means that you just harm the new cities and you have no development. But secondly, talking about the impact on the quality of life, right? I think firstly, just deal with idea of job opportunities. But they tell us that, cities are built around industries and therefore, it's a good thing or you're better able to find jobs. One, why are cities going to be built around industries? They've never explained to us why this is true, right? We think this is not likely for just for the fact that oftentimes cities are focused on tertiary economies, so things like banking, things like finance, things that require high skilled work, right? And I think industries oftentimes occur in far more rural areas. We don't think it's part of the debate. But secondly, as I mentioned before, oftentimes low-skilled labor and the demand for this labor requires a population to already exist, so such that you have people wanting to set up McDonald's and having people work as McDonald's workers, for example, right? And this means that insofar as this development doesn't exist, they don't actually get any jobs for these people moving. But then they tell us upskilling, we don't understand why there's going to be funding for upskilling insofar as a huge amount of money has been seen to be spent on these individuals. We don't think there'll be money spent on this. But I think Matt also tells you that wages tend to be lower anyways. Look, I think DPM misunderstands what Matt tells you, right? Recognize it's not that both areas symmetrically they are paid less. Oftentimes recognize that what happens is that companies can peg your salary based on the local cost of living, right? This is to say a company in a more higher cost of living city will oftentimes pay more even for the same job as compared to one in a smaller city that has a lower cost of living. This means that this impacts and implicates the whole point about buying more things, right? Because one, I think if you have no jobs, you have no money, but even if you do have a job, you tend to get lesser symmetrically relatively less money anyways. But also I think costs are quite similar, right? Because insofar as OG tells you that there are many factors that are nationwide, so things like energy problems and the energy crisis, for example, this means that they're still both like, there's still probably going to be like high costs for these utilities anyways, right? Then you tell us, oh, but you have welfare. This means that like you can like support yourself even though no development already exists. One, I think development just takes quite a bit of time, but two, like it's probably not going to be a lot insofar as it takes quite a lot of money to like move these people anyways. But I think that at the end of the day, like what this means is that if you move to these newer cities, the vulnerable are like far worse off, and they actually have no ability to like change anything. We think it's just bad. But how do we then change or like improve quality of life in major cities? But before I continue, closing.
Poor people living in cities are already working in sweatshops. The difference is the cost of living is lower in newer cities.
Yeah, and I told you that you'll get, one, there's like no jobs in those other areas, but two, like you probably have your wages can be even lower than what is in major cities. But then like let's move on to why quality of life improves in major cities, right? I think like this deals with two OG points. One on like how you have poor quality of living because i.e. slums, but two, like how you can inflate housing prices. One, I think like recognize that the issue of poor quality of living still exists on their side anyways, insofar as people are always attracted to major cities, i.e. people from urban areas do have an incentive to move to major cities because it's seen as like an area in which they can get more opportunities, more ability to get better money, right? This means that like you're probably going to have people entering these like areas anyways, and recognize that insofar as the people who are leaving through this program are like lower skilled workers and like poorer individuals, this means that like probably the kinds of people coming in to fill in the vacant like housing isn't people who are going to be like with high pay who are willing to take up this accommodation, right? It's probably going to be other unskilled laborers coming in as well. This just means that like the harm continues to exist, but like it's far worse because it's also now spread to like smaller cities. On our side, how do we get more change, right? I think one, recognize that like oftentimes the people who can actually change things are people who are well off. This means that insofar as like these slums continue to exist within the city, i.e. within their backyard, and they are actually affected by it because they may think that it's unsafe or whatnot, this means they have an incentive to actually like lobby the government to actually make developments to like improve the area, to improve the safety, right? Or like to even make sustainable housing as per the policy. This means that you actually spend on improving like the housing issue, you actually create like and improve situations for people who are living in slums. But if you're far away, what then happens is that comparatively you don't see the problem. People who are well off don't actually feel affected by it. They won't actually lobby the government to improve anything. And because of this, I think we proved to you why like vulnerable individuals are just far better in major cities. And because of that,
Thank you very much, Diallo. Let's have the member of government. Here.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear.
Awesome. I am going to start in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to give you 3 reasons as to why public housing in overdeveloped cities are extremely unlikely to succeed. The first reason is that it's going to be very difficult for you to justify the opportunity cost of constructing public housing. The reason for that is because these land that you're building on are likely to be land that's in prime locations. That's going to hold like strategic economic opportunities and value. To which end, for example, if the government or the city is trying to do urban planning and they have this plot of land that's going to be able to be built into a shopping mall or any like a factory, for example, that can like pay back the development in multitude, it's very difficult for you to be able to like say, okay, let's build public housing here, instead of something that's more valuable, that's going to give more people benefit because of how exclusive the location is. The second reason is that there's going to be a distinct lack of political will, especially from the affluent dwellers in the current city. The reason for this is twofold. One, there's overcrowding. So these people don't want more people coming in, presumably with no public housing, more people will leave. Or at least the impression is that people cannot come as easily. But the second reason, and more perverse reason, is that the more affluent dwellers oftentimes have like housing ownership in these cities already. And the fact of the matter is that sometimes when you build public housing, the housing prices in around that region also decrease. And that is a negative connotation. So what these people do is that they vote in like representatives or majors who may, like if they cannot strike down the building of these of this new public housing, they make it so that it's as restrictive, as slow, and as cumbersome as possible, meaning that it's very difficult for you to build additional housing projects. The third reason is that the entire process is just very, very unsustainable. The reason for that is because the urban population always increases exponentially past a certain level of development. The reason for this is twofold. One, there's a lot of people moving there already, but two, and more importantly, the people who have migrated here decades before then have children. So that what that means is that decade by decade, developing cities have to deal with more and more population growth, and therefore like demand is far likely to outstrip supply. The importance of this is that there's an element of sustainability to it. I'm saying public housing is likely to fail. I don't think anything from opposition has been done to contest this. If the materials stand, then I think they stand. Okay, I'm gonna then give you 3 reasons why relocation to different cities to low cost of living is likely to be good and likely to be successful. But before that, we have to understand the context, because OG only merely asserts, right, like the city is just cheaper. But I don't know why. I don't know what these cities look like. Look, historically, countries and states do not develop evenly. During industrialization and globalization, political hubs or transport hubs grow exponentially, but the other cities are oftentimes left behind in terms of development structurally, right? So, for example, in KL, you have 2 million people. In JB, you only have 1 million people. In Malacca, you have 500,000 people. In the city of Miri, you only have 100,000 people. The issue then is that these cities are underdeveloped, but there's also strong economic opportunities within these cities. The reason for that is because the economy has grown beyond just manufacturing and transport. It's gone into digitalization. What that means is that businesses do want to relocate like operations there because they're cheaper, and people can do work there because they don't have to have like physical contact with the business in order to create value. But the problem is the lack of critical mass and the lack of a workforce willing to twin the labor, because everyone usually wants to go to the city, and that's the assumption as to where economic opportunities are. What we do here is that we change this, right? We make it so that people from the city come to these places and they fill in that gap in terms of labor, and that creates more opportunities for everybody involved. There's 3 reasons why this is likely to work. The first is that there's a skill set match. So even if we take the worst case scenario where the people in the city right now who are going to migrate are people who are poor and living in dead-end jobs, they're likely to have some level of exposure with like corporations, with MNCs, with strong business dealings that are not so apparent in these places, which means that they are able to somewhat fill in the gaps and be able to to create opportunities for big companies to go and relocate some level of operations. The second reason is that because of the first reason, there's going to be strong receptivity. What that means is that the people who are in these like cheaper cities do want more people to come in order to create more opportunities for the people living there. So what that means is that you get more integration programs, you have more job schemes, and overall the sentiment of the locals is going to be very likely to be friendly and welcoming. And that's just something that is, like an extra kick for you to move there. But the last reason, I think the most important reason, is that you have more political will from like affluent urban dwellers to fund this program. So at the moment, they want to do everything they can to rewrite public housing program. But we can tell them, hey, we're going to move them somewhere else, but we need capital to do this. Can you help out? Suddenly you have like more political will for donations. You have potentially candidates trying to opt in and sign up this program to also like score points with the electorate, meaning that you get more resources on the outside of the house in relocating compared to on their side of the house in constructing. Like it's just easier to do things on outside because more people support it, more people donate, and like there's just fewer structural difficulties. The unique benefit that I want to bring to the house today, beyond just all the new mechanisms that are included, is that we uniquely achieve equity throughout the whole nation. So we even up development, right? We allow people to access economic opportunities everywhere within the country, and that's a good thing. The first 2 reasons for this. The first reason is that, look, at the moment, the choice to stay isn't exactly a choice. It's a coerced choice because there's the implicit assumption that everywhere else is less desirable. So in the case that these people in the city don't want to move, like how bad can it be how bad are conditions in the other side of the world? In which case, surely we need to do something to improve that. What we do on our side of the house is that we level out this playing field. So maybe at the start there's still some level of equity, but slowly as we even out human capital distribution, these places also have economic empowerment, and therefore people can make a better informed decision as to where they exactly really want to go in order to settle down, in order to make a life out of themselves. At the moment, they are coerced into going to and staying at the city. It's on our side of the house we can make a better active choice. So for example, if it's the case that your family is nearby a less like low cost of living city, you can actually be there instead of like trying to stuff yourself in the capital or a major city in order to make a living. The second reason is like this way of achieving economic empowerment is of mutual benefit rather than at the expense of one another, and that creates a lot more traction. It's also very perverse for some people to hold off economic development in order to starve off other people. That's something we don't have on our side. Before I go on, yes, I'll take one from one of the Ians, one of CEO.
Actually, why would people mobilize towards shipping people out of the city rather than mobilize towards improving public infrastructure like public transport, etc., to decrease overcrowding as well?
I just gave you like reasons as to why public housing is likely to fail. It's beyond just infrastructure, right? So one is like it's difficult for you to justify the use of land. 2 is that there are people who do not want people to come in. 2 reasons for this. 1 is overcrowding. 2 is that like the changes in property prices changes the net worth, and that's something they want to fight against. 3 is unsustainability. Okay, moving on. So why is it the case that all of the material here beats out opening? 3 reasons. The first is I will give you structural reasons why public housing is likely to fail, and this overrides the context on whether it's the case that people are going to likely have better or worse lives in the new cities. core issue here is that the solution of opposition is one that's unsustainable. And so outside the house, we have a more sustainable solution. The second reason is that we actually give you context of what these cities look like. In doing so, I explain to you why there is opportunities, why the comparative is not as bad, because like, sure, Malacca is not as well built as KL, but how much worse is it? 3, the comparative improves because when you have more injection of labor and capital, you get more economic opportunities, and therefore people are more likely to go there. More things are going to be built in these places. Lastly, in terms of impact, I think my impact on national equity is super cool and affects a lot of people. I think that's like the largest impact today's debate because it doesn't just affect the individual. For all these reasons, please start with CG.
Thank you very much, Member of Government. Let's invite the Member of Opposition. Here.
I'm sorry, let me just adjust my camera so it's I can stand up, practice for live tournaments and all that. I'm going to be very clear. This is a closing debate for the following reasons. Number one, uniquely, the benefits of opening opposition and opening government rely on an efficient use of resources. That is to say that assuming every dollar you spend towards towards subsidizing welfare as well as public services outside the city can be better spent in the city, then you get more value out of the dollar and therefore you help more people. Because presumably both sides have to agree that governments do not have infinite resources to be able to spend on either of these policies. Therefore, the team that wins this debate will be the team that proves to you that these resources are best spent. The point at which you are subsidizing things in cities rather than out of cities, and that's exactly what the closing extension will do. But furthermore, the closing extension will fill in crucial gaps in opening's case, whereby we believe that there's a fundamental deadlock between the idea that there are better paying jobs in cities versus better paying jobs outside cities. Only closing opposition will prove to you why the industries that exist within cities exist to provide these better paying jobs, thus undermining the competition mechanism of OG that undermines the case from OO as well, and that's why we'll take over them as well. But so the first thing I'll do then is so in my section I'm going to prove two things. Firstly, why we uniquely better help poor people who leave cities, and this will be a bunch of vertical analysis. I'll flag out to you why we're different. And secondly, why we better improve lives for people in cities and towards poor people within the state as a whole. And then I'll give rebuttals. Firstly, why do we better improve lives for people in cities? You cannot. This is the opposition told you that you will have higher pays for particular jobs within cities. The problem with the analysis at this point in the debate and why they're losing is opening government's analysis that actually certain cities are built around, for example, primary industries. For example, you have cities built around Wall Street and the financial industry, for example. The consequence of this is not clear why people who are particularly low skilled are going to get good jobs upon which are within cities as well. The way the closing opposition will uniquely enter this debate is by arguing that, in reality, even in cities which are primarily built around particular industries or particularly high-paying or tertiary sectors, you still need primary and secondary sectors to be able to support this. Why is this true? This is true because they still demand for the very, very basic necessities that everybody needs, right? So your Wall Street investors still need food, water, right? They still need goods and services. They still need the shipping industry, they still need transport industry, they still need manufacturing. All of these things are still necessary. The point at which you're in a big city or out of one, you still need janitors to clean the toilets of Wall Street as well. The consequence of this is that there are a large number of jobs within big cities which are competitively paying. Why are they necessarily paying better than those outside cities? A couple of reasons. Number one, the point at which you're in a large city is probably the point at which you have multinational corporations which just pay very well. The consequence of this is that as well as customers which just pay just far better. So for example, the point at which Wall Street investors are able to pay much better for food is the point at which you open a food store in a large city, is the point at which you can then charge more for food as well and get more of an income. What then do people use this income to do as well? So at this point in time, we've uniquely proven to you why salaries are higher. But notice that opening opposition's analysis was also lacking, in that they do not prove to you why this money necessarily translates to a better form of life. If you believe government benches material, that actually higher cost of living also come with higher pay, then at the end of the day, people end up becoming poor also. The crucial analysis coming from CEO as to why this higher pay translates to better better standards of living is that oftentimes this money circulates across the country as well. For the very simple reason that a lot of the times people move from poor areas to rich cities and then send money back for their family, right? That's why, for example, so many people from Sarawak leave Sarawak and move to KL to work in various sectors as well, whereby there is a higher demand and better pay, crucially because you're in a city and you can charge hard people more and corporations more for your service. The consequence of this is that that money then gets translated to your family outside the city area. This leads to those things like subsidizing your children's education or subsidizing a better education for your children. It leads towards your family actually having a better standard of life, the crucial thing that OG wanted to harp on about. We've seen in all of these instances, therefore, crucially, higher amounts of pay benefits people, analysis that only comes from CO. Therefore, only in CO do we actually complete the argument and let you believe that moving out of cities lets you get better salaries as well. Second reason why it's necessarily better for individuals within cities. We would argue that it's a more efficient use of resources. So this is a horizontal piece of analysis. The simple reason is because of economies of scale. That is to say that it's just far easier for governments to be able to set up certain sectors, such as a public transportation system, such as hospitals, the point at which they're centralizing it into a particular area, such as a large city. Why is this necessarily true? Because the cost of building 12 smaller hospitals is necessarily far larger than building one large hospital or two large hospitals that cater to larger numbers of people in big cities. You don't have to export as many people outside cities, for example, like doctors and teachers, to be able to set up new schools outside cities. We've seen in all of these instances the amount of money needed to transport all of the resources outside cities and to outside large cities and be able to move inland, for example, and transport your resources there to build housing, hospitals, etc. is far higher. Therefore, the bang out of your buck you get when you're investing in large cities is just much larger, the point at which you're able to do this. The consequence of this is that uniquely in closing, we prove to you that more people can benefit from these programs, the point at which you are subsidizing housing as well as other services in large cities, the point at which more people can access, therefore, healthcare services, is the point at which we win this debate and help more poor people throughout. Second piece of extension, where you necessarily worsen lives for people left behind. Notice that this is not just a political mechanism, because there's no inherent reason why rich people will necessarily form the empathy with poor people that opening opposition told you about. We would argue that the very simple market structure is enough. What does this mean? The point at which the large amounts of poor people move out of cities is the point at which the amount of demand for low quality housing or low cost housing decreases drastically. The consequence of this is that the average buyer of houses or the average buyer of every service is now richer. This means that corporations have incentive to then price up all of these resources as well and make life far harder for people who are poor. The consequence of this is that individuals who are left behind who are not able to benefit from these services necessarily have their cost of living raised so high that they cannot survive as well, because presumably government cannot subsidize every single poor person to move out of the city. Besides, they still need the poor there to work on their services as well. The consequence of this is that they will far worsen lives of people left behind. So a couple of points of rebuttal therefore to closing our government, because we recognize that our material clashes with that. The first structural reason is that they told us that actually that in cities you have prime land. For example, you need the land that is very expensive in prime areas. We would argue that cities are not all prime land. So for example, in cities you oftentimes have suburb areas as well as city areas outside your most expensive land. So obviously we're not building like low-cost housing in Orchard Road, for example, if we were Singapore. There's likely going to be places in Yishun, for example, which are cheaper as well. In all of these instances, we don't think that's always necessarily going to be a massive opportunity cost. Secondly, they told us that people are upset because of overcrowding. We would argue that for the most part, when people see like poor people in their area, they oftentimes don't necessarily agree that they want to ship these poor people to other places as well. Oftentimes, the consequence of this is that they want governments to then improve the services that they have. So for instance, your ability to then have a non-crowded public transport system, probably the best way to get that is to subsidize public transport better as well. That creates more political will to do that. In their world, they keep relying on roads as well, which hurts the poor as well. In closing opposition, we uniquely give you tie-breaking analysis that proves the arguments from all so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, member of opposition. Let's invite the government whip. Here.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, I'll just give me a second to and start my timer, look at my notes. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to deal with CO and then opening half. The biggest problem with CO is just that Ian is very unresponsive to Tan's case. And unfortunately for CO, a lot of Tan's material already preempts a lot of CO's material. The first thing that CO tells us is that they are able to get a higher amount of pay because the state now has greater ability to garner welfare because there's more efficient allocation of resources. So now they can give money to people on the ground that presumably increases their standard of living in one way or the other. But notice that Ian misses out the key structural analysis coming out from Thanh, which is that often cities are becoming more overpopulated. Political pressure from the elites often force these people to live in squatters, in slums. All of this means that the situations in which people get more welfare is going to be offset by the increase in poor people generally from the fact that there's greater overpopulation in of itself. So even if it's the case that Ian does get more welfare, one, when it's spread out to more people, the welfare is lesser overall. But secondly, it's unlikely you're going to get more money anyways because this housing policy is just going to fail. The second thing it tells us is that it's harder to develop hospitals and cities outside of, it's harder to develop new cities because it means that you need to drive the hospital all the way there, then you must slowly build the hospital in those kinds of regions. Two responses. The first is that Thanh really proves to you that these cities will probably be richer. They probably have enough money because a lot of companies will invest in them at the point where there's increase in population, when companies feel it's viable to set up their businesses there. This means that it's likely that at the point where these kinds of new cities get richer, they'll probably develop the area there. They probably do things like increase public transport, very similar to how Singapore created MRTs to facilitate more traveling between workers at the point where more businesses started investing in us because we had more money. But the second thing to note also is that even if it's a case that these cities don't become richer, notice that development is also far more expensive within these kinds of overpopulated cities, because given that there's overpopulation, it also means that your hospitals will get overcrowded, right? Given that these kinds of cities already have an overpopulation problem, a lack of land, it means that the building and development of new hospitals, new facilities, new car parks whatsoever is going to be extremely expensive and cost a lot of time for the state. All of these reasons already means that that the state can't just build more hospitals in and of itself within new cities, but also the fact that even if they do, they probably get overrun by the fact that there's an overpopulation of individuals within these areas. We'll see you out of the way. I don't want to talk about the opening clash. Opening clash largely centered around two questions. The first question is, will individuals opt in? And the second question is whether or not the alternative of living in new cities are inherently better. The first question about whether or not individuals will move to these kinds of cities is noticeably largely contingent on the second clash, because both Gulf teams agree that at the point where we prove that there's a better alternative, most individuals will move towards those kinds of cities. But I want to take out open opposition's contribution towards this question. They give 4 reasons why people are going to stay within these cities. The first is that they have friends and families. The second is that jobs in these places. The third is that they have kids who are in schools, and the last reason is personal attachment. Notice that the first and fourth reasons don't make sense, because it's unclear why you can't visit your friends and family in the old cities that you move away from. But surely your ability to uplift yourself is also far more important than your personal feelings towards the city that you live in. But furthermore, often people living in these kinds of cities in poor conditions feel extremely jaded to their surroundings. They don't like the fact that they live in these kinds of cities. It's why poor people in gangs in LA often talk crap about LA. They often say how LA is a shithole, for instance. The point I'm trying to make is that they do not have the kinds of attachment that OO is trying to suggest already. The second and third reason about jobs in these places and have kids in these schools are throwaway reasons, because they don't really give you reasons as to why this outweigh the ability to uplift your life. We think that at the point where you're able to get better jobs and your kids are able to attend better schools is probably the point in which you choose to move out of these kinds of cities anyway. You accept the government deal in and of itself. With that out of the way, the question in this debate then boils down to, is the alternative better? Are new cities better than the old cities in which this individual live in? OG tells us that these cities have more funding because there's a lack of urbanization, more people enter these areas. The second thing they tell you is that there's more job opportunities. The last thing they tell you is that people will move in big numbers. The problem is that, one, they don't explain why is it that new industries will enter these kinds of areas to uplift these new cities. That's their first problem. But the second problem they don't explain is also why is it that people will choose opt-in, given the fact that it's unclear in their speeches why is it that new cities comparatively give a better life to poor people in and of itself. Notice this is why Thanh was extremely important, because Thanh told you a few things. Thanh said that recognize that often old cities are left behind from development due to industrial level situations. So the Industrial Revolution only concentrated industrialization in London, for instance, leaving other cities comparatively less developed with lesser population. But in this new era, at the point where there are things like digitalization, where there are new tech companies are emerging, these kinds of companies often want to set up their businesses in new cities where they can tap into lesser corporate taxes or other kinds of reasons that Thanh gives you. But the problem here is that there's a lack of manpower within these kinds of places in and of itself already, which is to say that there's an incentive to invest in this area, but there's a lack of manpower to meet the needs of these kinds of companies. At the point in which we incentivize people to enter these kinds of areas is a point in which companies are likely to continue to invest in these kinds of places. Note that even if this is a gradual process, it also means that long-term, more companies will get richer, and we think that's a good thing. Before I continue, I'll take one from opening.
Regardless of CEO's analysis on the cost of developing smaller cities, the lack of political capital is logically prior. We gave you analysis on why majority of middle to high class individuals will not relocate. How are you still going to get any development in small cities if only marginalized individuals move?
Yeah, but the debate is literally about people who are in need. Like, the context of these cities have overpopulation, got a lot of poor people living in slums. A lot of them are living in slums. We move them to new cities, then they big population. That's how we solve the problem. But Thanh gives you structural reasons as to why these cities are always a good alternative. So at the point where they get more development, that's a good thing. But notice that OG talks about how you get more choice. But the reason why it's important in this, so O tells you that these people live in sweatshops. We told you that they are already working in sweatshops within their current cities already. But note that their principle is also very ridiculous, right? Because what they're saying is that we don't want to uplift the life of people. Because if at the point where more poor people get up into the upper stratosphere of the class system, then there'll be lesser poor people to push for the rights of other poor people. But the point is that it's what Thanh said that's important. Because if it's true that there's going to be countrywide kind of development where every city gets some form of equal development, then notice that that's where you increase more choices for people to move to. So if it's a case that one city has a lot of sweatshops, individuals now have the choice to move towards cities that don't have sweatshops. So that's important in terms of giving greater social mobility, but greater choice to people who are choosing to move towards those regions. At the end of the day, the only thing that proves to you that new cities are better alternatives is CG. For these reasons, propose.
Thank you very much, Government Whip. To wrap up this debate and the preliminary rounds of this tournament, I call upon the opposition. Here.
Okay, cool. Chicken that can be heard.
Yep, you can.
Okay, awesome. I'll aim to take 2 POIs. I'll probably call upon you during my speech. The problem with the government case and their model as a whole is I think they severely underestimate how much money it's going to cost in order for their model to be actually effective, in order for their model to actually move people out of these cities. Given that we point this out in our member speech, I think what this means is that all the benefits they're talking about are going to be incredibly expensive. And at the point in time where we point to you that it's a much more efficient allocation of resources, that is every dollar you spend doing what CEO tells you to do, this leads to much higher increases in the quality of life for these important, for these people, poor people we're talking about. We're going to take today's debate. Okay, what am I going to do in my speech? Quickly, I'll just give you a TLDR of the debate. Then I'm going to go through and whack each house one by one and show why we come out on top. Okay, then. So I think TLDR is basically I think OG are out because of the opportunity cost. That I said earlier. I think CG are out because they inherit much of the same problems as OG. But moreover, I also think large parts of their case are derivative, and I don't think they do enough to show why the new sort of mechanisms they come in are meaningfully different or add much impact to what OG has already proven. Plus, a lot of stuff coming out of Wayne was just entirely new with the whip speech. And then I also think, in terms of OO, they run the stuff about political and social change. I think they impact this enough, and they also don't give you the crucial mechanism for why it's going to work, which we did to you in our member speech. Okay, then. So let me talk to you about, I think, the idea of this opportunity cost. So first of all, just recognize that OG in their model just ends up throwing a lot of money at this program. So not only do you have to give them money to incentivize people poor people to move out of these cities, you also have to give them money and welfare to support them, as well as this money which they're supposedly going to go towards investing in these new towns that they're going to move to in order to make it attractive places to live in, and then they're going to be able to have good jobs there. So like, first of all, that's just a lot of money that you have to add in, right? And like, okay, I think a couple of reasons for why the amount of money that is going to be required to actually incentivize these people are going to be incredibly high. I think stuff that we've already given to you. I think it's just just recognizing the fact that like that like either you already live in the city, as in like historically you're familiar with housing, in which case you probably already own land, so you're probably not that like pushed and pressured by price because you already own your house. Otherwise you moved into the city, in which case where was your home previously? Presumably in the countryside, your family still lives there, you're still able to move back. So therefore the amount of money you need in order to incentivize these people to move back is probably going to be pretty high. The amount of like welfare cushioning is also probably going to be pretty high in order to entice these people to leave. Moreover, like I think like the idea of being able to get investment into these small towns they move into is probably going to be very hard as well, because like for the very same reasons that OG pointed out, that these workers are going to be low skilled, and that's the reason that like they aren't making it in these cities. Like once they move into these new towns, what reason are there for businesses to invest and put money into this if all the workers and influx of like human capital is low skilled? We think it's gonna be really, really hard. That means all like sure, maybe OG and government bench does have benefits. The problem is it takes an inordinate amount of money to do it, plus they just forego all the money that we would otherwise put into building building public housing. I'll give you OG, I'll give you a chance to defend yourself.
Yeah, we also explained that by funding housing, you actually worsen the very cost of living and overcrowding crisis, which is forcing people onto the streets. We provide the only possible solution to a cycle that would just keep on getting worse.
No, not really, because if you're giving these people money to move out, you're putting more money into like the housing market of these cities like outside of the big cities. So we think you fuck their housing market up and make it worse. But also we uniquely can stand for just building houses, and increasing the housing stocks puts downward pressure on prices because you increase supply. That's how like basic economics works. Okay, then. So I think just recognize that all of OG's benefits are there's a really incredibly high cost to that. I think compare that against all the material we gave to you about how like investments per dollar you put in is going to be better in terms of like, you know, I think just building more efficient infrastructure in terms of the hospitals, the number of hospitals you're going to get, the number of like schools you're going to get. I think just the provision of services you see, like plus just better urbanization you're going to get by building density is going to be far higher on opposition side. Let's talk about CG. So like, I just want to note that it's incredibly funny that the Singaporean team here, like the properly Singaporean team, is bashing public housing. Anyway, like I think that like if the only analysis this fails, I think for the reason that I think like in this in the counterfactual, it's probably worse. Like all the reasons they give you about like why people don't want public housing is probably like presumably the status quo where people are living in slums or they're working in like incredibly squalid conditions with like really poorly maintained housing, like the people living around that and the property values of that are probably even worse than if you like the government came in, spent money to build public housing and to do them up nicely. Like guys, you can do public housing well. Just look at Singapore. Like 90% of the population lives in public housing. It's perfectly doable. It's perfectly doable there. I think they as I said, I don't think they do sufficient differentiation there besides there as well. So I don't think they have a particularly unique contribution. CG, come on, hit me with the POI. No? Okay, cool. Well, I offered. All right, let's talk about OO here quickly, because I think they're largely out of the debate, because I think, first of all, most of the case is pretty, like, what do you call it? Like just basically what's based on Ruddle. Only unique positive material here, I think, is like the stuff about social change, but it's unclear how that social change comes along. We provide you the mechanism when we tell you that like these people are only listened to when they're able to strike in the cities, because that's where they're most that's where they're most visible. Striking in like a small mid-tier city is going to get much less media coverage than when they strike in a really important city that they talk about. Okay, so that's why I think the OO contribution. That's why I think we like fill in the gaps for OO then. Okay, then let's lastly talk about the unique material that we bring from you from closing opposition, because like recognize that like apart from just like the more efficient use of money you're going to get and the higher increases in quality of living you're going to get from the provision of infrastructure like education, like transport, like healthcare that you're going to get, importantly I think there are also a number of important social benefits you're going to get here as well, in terms of being able to send remittances back to your home family, but also just like being able to provide good education for your children who go to these schools in the city. So I think that means then, like, Judge, what you have to consider is that when the government has a limited amount of money and they have to choose how to allocate it, the best use of this money is to put it towards building like public housing and increasing people's ability to stay in cities, that is building housing stock for them to be able to bring the price down, make it afford more for people to live in economic productive regions of the area, rather than just throwing money at people to tell them to go elsewhere and hoping that the problem magically disappears. Vote for CEO, vote for the team which is planning to like take this money and actually build productive things for society.
Thank you very much, Opposition Whip, and thank you everyone for what was an amazing debate. I think we can just end the recording here.